On the evening of August 1st, 1914, Kaiser Wilhelm II received a telegram that made him believe Britain would stay out of the war, on one condition. Germany had to confine its attack to the Eastern Front, Russia only. France untouched. The Kaiser was elated. He summoned his chief of the General Staff, Helmuth von Moltke, and issued the order, turn the army east. Moltke reportedly told him it could not be done. For weeks, 1 million men had been moving west on railway schedules calculated to the hour. The timetables governed the trains governed the army. Reversing direction now would not produce a reoriented attack, it would produce a disorganized mob incapable of fighting anyone. According to Moltke's memoir, the Kaiser's reply was bitter. "Your uncle," he said, Moltke the Elder, the great strategist of the wars of unification, would have given a different answer. The army went west. After the war, the chief of the German Railway Division, General Hermann von Stab, was so incensed by Moltke's claim that he published a book packed with timetables and graphs proving the redirection was entirely possible, routing 170 trains per army corps on tracks that already existed through a plan that was already written. The supreme warlord of Germany had been defeated by a general who refused to try. 30 years later, a different German leader was asleep when the Allies landed at Normandy. His staff knew by 6 in the morning. The panzer divisions capable of mounting an immediate counterattack were within striking distance, and at 4:30 that morning, Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt had already ordered them toward the coast. But because they belonged to the OKW Strategic Reserve, General Alfred Jodl countermanded the order, terrified to commit them without Hitler's direct authorization. And no one would wake him. By the time the order finally came through, hours later, Allied air power was already waiting on every road north. The armoured counterattack that might have thrown the invasion back into the sea moved in daylight in piecemeal columns against an enemy already ashore and dug in. Two leaders, 30 years apart, both prisoners of a command structure they couldn't or wouldn't override. Joseph Goebbels did not build his ministry from scratch. He built it from a diagnosis, and the diagnosis was Hitler's. Hitler devoted an entire chapter of Mein Kampf to the propaganda war of 1914 to 18. His conclusion: Germany had been out-argued before it was out-fought. British atrocity stories had reached the neutral world. German military communiques had reached the press office. What each side communicated to its own population and to everyone watching was, in Hitler's reading, one of the structural causes of the German collapse. When Goebbels established the Reich Ministry of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda in March 1933, he wasn't improvising. He was correcting a failure that had already been named. By 1939, the regime had subsidized and distributed over 12 million Volksempfänger across German households. The sets were engineered without shortwave bands, built to receive state broadcasts and block foreign frequencies. Every cinema was a delivery mechanism. The population had not simply been informed of policy, it had been manufactured into consensus. The Kaiser's Germany communicated through a military-run press apparatus designed for a century when the home front was assumed to follow the army. Hitler understood that the 20th century had inverted that relationship. The population first, the army followed. In this domain, the margin between them is 40 years of institutional evolution, but propaganda only ever wins the home front. The army was the harder test, and there the two men diverge in ways still argued over. By the autumn of 1916, Wilhelm II was signing orders other men had written. Paul von Hindenburg and Erich Ludendorff drafted them. The Kaiser approved them. The standard version calls this wise delegation, the monarch stepping back, the professionals stepping in, Germany brought within reach of winning. The reality was harder. Historians since Martin Kitchen have called what Hindenburg and Ludendorff built a silent dictatorship, a military regime in all but name. They hadn't received that authority from the Kaiser. They had taken it. Wilhelm's personal popularity had been so thoroughly eclipsed that Hindenburg's image appeared on more German commemorative objects than the emperor he nominally served. Russia was driven from the war. The spring offensive of 1918 advanced further into France than any German operation since 1914, coming closer to breaking the Allied line than most accounts now acknowledge. In 1940, Hitler backed the radical armoured thrust through the Ardennes when his own general staff considered it an operational gamble likely to end in catastrophe. The generals wanted a modified Schlieffen plan. Hitler wanted Erich von Manstein's. France fell in 6 weeks. He was right. The general staff became an obstruction to be overridden rather than a resource to be used. The no-retreat orders at Stalingrad cost Germany 250,000 men. In the summer of 1944, the same fortress city doctrine applied to Army Group Center produced Operation Bagration. With German casualties, historians estimate at between 300 and 400,000 men. The Kaiser became irrelevant, and Germany nearly won. Hitler stayed in control, and Germany lost the Eastern Front in segments. Both men also had a moment when the war could still have been talked to a close. The outcome unresolved, a rational exit on the table. What the Kaiser tried in December 1916 and what Hitler offered in July 1940 were not what they appeared to be, and in one case the leader's own generals slammed the exit shut behind him. If this is the kind of history you come here for, subscribe and hit the notification bell, and stay with it. In 1890, Kaiser Wilhelm II dismissed Otto von Bismarck. Wilhelm was 31, impatient with the man who had unified Germany and spent 2 decades keeping every major European power from combining against it. Within 3 years of Bismarck's departure, France and Russia had signed a military convention. The reinsurance treaty with Russia had been allowed to lapse. The alliance system assembled itself almost immediately once the architecture that had contained it was gone. The Kaiser then backed Alfred von Tirpitz's risk theory, and Britain's response was the opposite of deterrence. Britain accelerated its dreadnought program, concentrated its fleet in the North Sea, signed an entente with France, and secured its eastern position through an agreement with Russia. Germany's naval expansion didn't deter Britain. It recruited Britain into the opposing coalition. On December 11, 1941, 4 days after Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor, Hitler declared war on the United States. Hitler had no treaty obligation to act. Von Ribbentrop knew it and stalled when the Japanese ambassador sought confirmation. Hitler overrode him within 48 hours without consulting his military planners, without pre-positioning his submarine fleet. When Admiral Karl Dönitz finally sent U-boats toward the American coast, he had 5 long-range boats available. 5 against the shipping lanes of a continent-spanning economy because the rest of his operational fleet was already tied down in the Mediterranean and the Arctic by prior political directives. When those 5 boats arrived off the American seaboard in January 1942, they found the coastal cities completely unblacked out. U-boat commanders sank merchant vessels silhouetted against the neon lights of seaside resorts and the glow of Coney Island. Germany had declared war on the largest industrial power on Earth. Its coastline still looked like peacetime. The Kaiser spent a decade recruiting Britain with a deterrence theory that sounded plausible. Hitler did it in 48 hours and called it an alliance. Walk onto the floor of a German armaments plant in 1943, and a large share of the workers bent over the machines aren't German citizens at all. They're prisoners and conscripts shipped in from occupied Europe. The numbers explain why. Germany's female workforce in 1939 stood at roughly 14.6 million. By 1944, that figure was approximately 14.9 million, essentially flat across 5 years of total war. The gap was filled instead by roughly 7.5 million foreign workers, prisoners of war, and coerced labourers, who constituted nearly a quarter of the total German workforce by the autumn of 1944. In the Kaiser's Germany, between 1914 and 1918, the number of women employed in machine-building industries increased by a factor of approximately 35. In electrical manufacturing, the increase was nearly eightfold. The Kaiser's war economy pulled its own women into heavy industry at a scale the Nazi state never attempted. Hitler's Germany filled the same gap, with people who had no choice. Albert Speer's armaments production surge between early 1942 and the summer of 1944 is presented as the Third Reich's great economic achievement. Speer chose January 1942, one of Germany's lowest production months of the war, as his baseline. Much of the aircraft production increase that drove the headline figures happened under Erhard Milch, who operated outside Speer's authority entirely. From a trough that low, almost any climb looks like genius. The army Speer was supplying marched into the Soviet Union with somewhere between 600,000 and 750,000 horses, comparable to the Imperial Army's equine strength in 1914. The most modern war machine in Europe was conquering a territory 10 times larger at the same pace. Both men hit the same wall, the point where the war demanded more than the economy could sustain. How each of them tried to get out of the war before that happened is a different question entirely. On December 12, 1916, Chancellor Bethmann Hollweg's government published a peace note offering to open negotiations. No borders, no conditions on Belgium. Nothing concrete enough to accept or reject. The Allied reply called it a war maneuver, and the description was not unfair. But the note had a quieter companion. While it was being publicly dismissed, a parallel channel was running through Washington. Hollweg was signalling a genuine willingness to accept mediation and to consider Belgian restoration. 4 weeks later, Hindenburg and Ludendorff pushed through unrestricted submarine warfare. Both generals understood that this made American entry almost certain. They accepted that calculation because they believed a blockade could force Britain out before American forces arrived in strength. The men the Kaiser had empowered to run his war used that authority to close the one exit that might have existed. Hitler's war termination record is starker. His July 1940 appeal to Britain from the Reichstag floor was framed as generosity and structured as theatre, vague enough to be rejected without negotiation, which is what happened. After 1941, no serious German peace effort appears in the record. The Casablanca Declaration of Unconditional Surrender in January 1943 formally removed the off-ramp, but the reality of the war of annihilation in the East meant the diplomatic window had shattered long before anyone put it in writing. Both men had windows, neither one had a statesman. Put Hitler in front of a map of Europe, and he could trace the whole war as a sequence. This campaign feeding the next, each conquest setting up the one after it. He could explain to his generals why every operation connected to the last. The vision was coherent in the only sense that mattered operationally. Lebensraum in the East, the removal of what he considered racial enemies, a chain of wars assembling into a single legible design. Catastrophic destination, but real architecture. The Kaiser had no equivalent. Weltpolitik was an aspiration, Germany as a world power, a place in the sun, expressed through individual acts that accumulated no coherent direction. He fired the one man in Europe who understood how to manage Germany's position and spent the next 20 years discovering what that cost. The counter-argument, and it has serious defenders, is that the Kaiser's absence of vision was a strategic asset. Because he had no fixed ideological map, Hindenburg and Ludendorff could adapt to military reality rather than forcing reality to conform to ideology. When Hitler's vision met the actual terrain of the Eastern Front, where the Soviet state did not collapse in 6 weeks as required, the vision won, and the army was bled dry trying to make it true. A clear wrong map may carry you to the wrong destination faster than no map at all. The High Seas Fleet, the Kaiser's signature project, the instrument that pushed Britain into the opposing coalition, the second most powerful navy on Earth, fought exactly one major engagement, Jutland, in May 1916. The German fleet inflicted greater losses on the Royal Navy than it received. Then it sailed home. Britain kept the North Sea. The blockade never loosened. In October 1918, ordered out on a final death ride to preserve the Navy's honour in the war's closing weeks, the sailors at Wilhelmshaven and Kiel refused. The mutiny spread within days. The revolution that followed forced the Kaiser's abdication in 2 weeks. The fleet built to intimidate Britain sat at anchor for most of the war, won a battle that altered nothing and sparked the revolution that ended the empire that built it. Wilhelm left authority unclaimed long enough for the men who filled it to close the exit he never found. Hitler claimed all authority, fixed an ideology around it, and then had no mechanism for correction when that ideology pointed Germany at a coalition it could not beat. 2 different command failures, 1 recognizable outcome. Which is harder to survive? The leader who loses direction or the leader who controls it so completely that no one can redirect him? You know where to put yours. If you think one of those failure modes was structurally survivable and the other was never going to be, hit subscribe. Thanks for watching.